The Goblin King used the repel skill. The Goblin King's body emitted a dazzling radiance, and he suddenly leaped into the air before landing heavily on the ground. With a resounding boom, all the skeletal warriors surrounding him were blasted away. Even the skeletal warriors on the ground were pushed back by the shockwave. Following that, the Goblin King's eyes also emitted a radiant red light as he opened his large mouth and spewed forth flames. The flames engulfed the skeletal warriors, scorching them. Lin sensed that the HP of the skeletal warriors in the front was rapidly fading, on the verge of approaching the brink of death. A thought flashed through his mind, and the 4 skeletal warriors were immediately retracted into the summoning space. The Goblin King continued spewing flames, preventing the skeletal warriors from approaching. "I must interrupt his skill," Lin muttered, as a ball of purple flame appeared in the palm of his hand. Soul Flame. The flame silently and effortlessly landed on the head of the Goblin King. The Goblin King immediately let out a deafening scream, and his skill was abruptly halted and interrupted. The Soul Flame disregarded defenses and directly inflicted spirit damage. The skeletal warriors swiftly gathered around, relentlessly launching their attacks. Lin continued using the Soul Flame to assault the Goblin King, preventing it from using its skills effectively. After 1 minute, the Goblin King fell to the ground, wearing an expression of unwillingness. As if it was saying, "What the hell, man? First is Sung Jin Woo and now you?" Defeated Goblin King. Experience 40,000. Obtained bronze grade weapon, Goblin King's dagger. Obtained bronze grade armor, Robe of Knowledge. Obtained Goblin King's crystal core. As the notifications appeared, a leveling radiance also emanated from Lin's body. Lin had finally reaching level 12. Soloing a nightmare-level dungeon took just over an hour, but it granted him more than 1 level of experience. Lin examined his rewards. Goblin King's dagger, bronze grade, strength +10, agility +10, 3% increase in assassin-type skill power. Robe of Knowledge, bronze grade armor, spirit +10, health +10, 5% reduction in cooldown time for mage skills. The dagger had no use for Lin, so he stowed it away to sell later. Lin immediately changed into the Robe of Knowledge, increasing his spirit and health by 10 points each. In addition to the equipment, there was the Goblin King's crystal core. The Goblin King's crystal core was larger than those of lower-level monster cores and had a more captivating appearance. It glowed a vibrant red, resembling a ruby. Holding it in his hand, Lin could feel a warm sensation emanating from it. By taking the core back to the trading post, he could exchange it for 10,000 gold coins. After leveling up, Lin's spiritual power was completely restored. He immediately summoned 4 more skeletal warriors. The skill to summon skeletal warriors had also reached level 12, and the total number of summoned warriors had increased to 60. With a good mood, Lin walked towards the exit of the dungeon. Lin abruptly appeared at the entrance of the dungeon. Lin immediately caught everyone's attention. Onlookers were surprised to see him actually come out unscathed, and some even noticed the Robe of Knowledge he was wearing. Lin didn't pay attention to the gossip around him. The dungeon had entered its cool-down period, and he would have to wait 12 hours before being able to enter again. Having experienced 1 dungeon run, he had no interest in grinding low-level monsters anymore. The experience gained from killing a dozen monsters was far less than what he could gain from killing just 1 in the dungeon. Lin then walked to a secluded spot and sat down. A loyal skeletal warrior stood faithfully beside him, guarding him. This dungeon run held a special significance for him. Most importantly, it made him understand his weaknesses. He also realized the utility of his skills. If used effectively, Corpse Explosion was an unrivaled area of effect skill. Soul Flame could interrupt the enemy's skills and dealt powerful spirit damage that bypassed defenses. Even nightmare-level bosses found it difficult to withstand. Lin waited for the cool-down period to pass, eagerly anticipating the moment when he could enter the dungeon again. As night fell, he concluded his meditation, his spiritual energy nearly restored. Outside the entrance of the dungeon, numerous bonfires had been set up, and many people gathered around them, roasting meat. The aroma of the meat filled the air, becoming even more enticing after being seasoned. These people were seasoned adventurers who frequently ventured into the wilderness, and they were well prepared. Unlike Lin, who had only brought some sweet potatoes when he left. He felt hungry, and his stomach began to protest. Lin reached for the sweet potatoes, only to realize that he had given them all to Ning Yi. Thinking of Ning Yi's mischievous and adorable appearance, a slight smile graced Lin's lips. He took out some steamed buns instead and began to devour them, 1 bite at a time. As he stood up, He noticed that the entrance of the dungeon was crowded with people. Two groups seemed to be in a standoff. One group stood at the entrance, completely blocking it off and preventing anyone from getting close. They were dressed in matching uniforms, wielding well-crafted weapons, resembling a well-organized guild. Opposing them were the professionals who were originally outside the dungeon. During the commotion, he seemed to understand what was happening. The Dynasty Guild was arrogantly blocking everyone from entering the dungeon, prompting many people to be annoyed and protest. A mage wielding a staff stepped forward from the Dynasty Guild and said, "Our young guild leader is inside the dungeon, completing a mission. Until his mission is finished, none of you are allowed to enter." The professionals voiced their protests, but nobody dared to make a move. Mainly because the Dynasty Guild was incredibly powerful, and they didn't want to provoke them too much. Suddenly, the mage from the Dynasty Guild took action, launching a fireball towards one of the protesters, killing him instantly. The onlookers were in a state of panic. Can't believe they would just kill someone. While the leading mage simply sneered, he just killed a freelance professional, taunting the crowd. If they have the gut, they can find their revenge in the Dynasty Guild. Lin was filled with questions. He approached a nearby professional and asked what was going on. The professional explained that the Dynasty Guild needed the Goblin King's crystal core, which had a low drop rate and could only be obtained in nightmare-level dungeons. Furthermore, it only dropped once every 100 days. The task listed on the trading post was actually posted by the Dynasty Guild, but nobody had been able to complete it. Also, it was quite ridiculous, considering the value of the Goblin King's crystal core was at least 30,000 gold coins. The guild offered to buy it for only 10,000, so who would sell it to them? What a coincidence. The Goblin King's crystal core in his storage space. The Dynasty Guild would undoubtedly return empty-handed. Originally, Lin had considered selling the Goblin King's crystal core in a couple of days when he returned. But now, hearing what the person had said, it was clear that the crystal core was anything but ordinary. Lin then asked how to use the crystal core, and the professional explained that the Goblin King's crystal core could be forged by a blacksmith into the Goblin King's ring. The Goblin King's ring provided a +10 boost to all attributes and increased the level of all skills by 1. It could be used at level 15 and was renowned as the strongest accessory for characters below level 40. Rumors had it that the young guild leader of the Dynasty Guild was aiming to enter the Xiajing Academy, so he was determined to obtain this equipment. With an understanding of the situation, Lin smiled slightly and walked towards the entrance of the dungeon. He didn't care about the Dynasty Guild. They were just obstacles to his leveling progress. The people who were previously protesting suddenly stopped and looked at Lin. With a skeletal warrior by his side, Lin proceeded towards the dungeon entrance, the sound of bones cracking accompanying their steps. The professional became extremely nervous and tried to pull Lin back. The professional urged, his voice filled with concern. The mage representing the Dynasty Guild stared coldly at Lin. Behind him, several members of the guild focused their gaze on Lin. They were all above level 20. Knights, warriors, mages, archers, and support classes were among their ranks. Moreover, their equipment was exceptional, ranging from weapons to armor and accessories, all of them bronze grade. Lin stood in front of the mage and calmly said, "Move out of the way." The Dynasty Guild's mage treated his words as if he had heard the most amusing joke. Lin continued,
"Don't stop me from entering the dungeon or I'll kill you."
Lin spoke coldly. He wasn't joking at all. The mage sneered and cast a detection spell that landed on Lin. Then, a mocking laughter escaped his lips as it turned out that Lin was just a level 12 nobody. Even though they had never encountered the class of a necromancer before, the fact that he was just a level 12 nobody was undeniable. Despite the voices urging Lin to retreat, he paid no attention to any of them. His voice gradually turned cold as he spoke.
"One last time, step aside or die."
The mage felt a chilling sensation emanating from Lin's words, causing an involuntary shiver to run down his spine. The gaze in Lin's eyes sent a shiver down his heart, leaving him wondering how could a level 12 makes him feel terrified. However, in the next moment, he snapped back to reality, raising his staff in a threatening manner. He intended to kill Lin if he took one more step. Lin looked at the mage, his lips twitching slightly. With a casual utterance of a single word, the skeletal warriors dashed forward like lightning. In the blink of an eye, the skeletal warrior appeared before the mage, raising its weapon to strike. The mage wore a smirk on his face and simultaneously activated a faint pink energy shield. The skeletal warrior's blade struck the energy shield, causing it to deform dramatically, nearly reaching the point of breaking. In that instant, The mage's face turned pale. What kind of summoned creature was this? Lin ordered the skeletal warrior to use its skills, and the skeletal warrior's blade immediately emitted a dazzling red light. Rampage strike. The mage was frightened out of his wits. Who could have anticipated that this summoned creature would also possess such a powerful skill? He felt the threat of death. Without a doubt, if this attack lands, not only would his energy shield shatter, but he would also die. Resist Flame Ring! The mage activated his skill in an instant. The flame ring erupted, pushing the skeletal warrior several meters away. The members behind him were also astonished. The mage shouted, "What are you all waiting for? Attack!" The mage felt like he had just narrowly escaped death. His face turned pale, and he shouted loudly. A knight responded to his call, activating a charge skill. Holding up his shield, he charged forward and forcefully collided with the skeletal warrior, covering a distance of over 10 meters. To everyone's surprise, the knight let out a girly scream. Among the screams, the knight was sent flying. The skeletal warrior remained unmoved. In terms of strength, the skeletal warrior was clearly superior. It charged forward once again, faithfully carrying out Lin's command. The mage quickly retreated, instructing his companions to kill Lin. The best way to deal with a summoner was not to kill the summoned creature, but to eliminate the summoner themselves. As long as the summoner died, the summoned creature would naturally disappear. 2 archers simultaneously released their arrows. Several arrows flew towards Lin, yet he didn't dodge or flinch. His expression remained unchanged. A black vortex appeared in front of Lin, and 2 skeletal warriors rose simultaneously, blocking the incoming arrows perfectly, one on the left and one on the right. The arrows struck the skeletal warriors' weapons, producing a metallic clashing sound, but they didn't cause any damage. The 2 archers quickly retreated, shocked that Lin had more than one summoned creature. The mage shouted loudly, and immediately, all of the knights and warriors rushed to stand in front of him, shielding him from the skeletal warriors. With no immediate danger, the mage raised his staff and pointed it at Lin, rapidly chanting an incantation. A giant flame erupted from the ground. Several seconds later, a fire serpent shot out from his staff, heading straight towards Lin. This was a rare skill that only a level 20 mage could learn, and it was considered the strongest skill for a level 20 mage. Some of the people behind Lin were worried for him. However, Lin remained calm and still. Another vortex appeared in front of him. This time, dozens of skeletal warriors emerged, and the fire serpent danced upon them. With a thunderous explosion, a brilliant blaze erupted. In the midst of the flames, dozens of skeletal warriors charged forward, pouncing towards the members of the Dynasty Guild. The mage's face turned incredibly grim. The appearance of 3 skeletal warriors earlier had already surprised him, but he never expected such a large number to appear all at once. The quantity of the skeletal warriors have now exceeded their own numbers. The mage was highly experienced, yet he remained calm and composed. Commanding the members of the guild, he had them form a formation to confront the legion of skeletal warriors. No doubt the Dynasty Guild was truly a guild seasoned with countless battles and enriched with experience. Each of their professionals had undergone extensive combat training and possessing outstanding teamwork. They swiftly gathered, ready for action. At the forefront stood the knights, while warriors, archers, and mages took the center for maximum damage output. The support members remained at the back, rapidly bestowing buffs upon their comrades: strength enhancement, agility boost, and mental fortification. Their speeds surged, energy shields activated, and the berserk mode activated. Not a single buff was omitted. Every possible status enhancement was applied. Confidence returned to the mage's face. At this moment, Lin raised his hand, ordering the onlookers to step back. At this point, no one dared to defy his words. Who could have imagined that he alone would confront a dozen members of the Dynasty Guild? Everyone immediately stepped back, creating a considerable distance. The mage suddenly caught sight of a flash of purple flames before witnessing a tragic scene. A skilled archer let out a scream. The archer's life rapidly plummeted, teetering on the edge of death in an instant. Swiftly, a healing spell landed on the archer, but it failed to save him. Much to everyone's horror, the archer was dead, struck down in an instant. The mage's loud commands made the whole team grow even more tense. With dozens of skeleton warriors charging towards them, even the valiant knight was now overwhelmed. He had to endure the attacks of over 10 skeleton warriors simultaneously. Activating his limitless defense, he was continuously bombarded by the rampage strikes from the skeleton warriors. Though healing spells rained down upon him, he still felt unbearable pain, fearing that he might fall at any moment. One healing spell after another was thrown his way, yet under the relentless assault of the skeleton warriors, the radiance of his limitless defense was rapidly waning. Just as the knight's limitless defense dissipated, Lin unleashed the soul flame once again. The soul flame flew towards the knight, causing the knight to wail in agony. More than 10 rampage strikes struck the knight simultaneously. Even the support healer couldn't keep up, and in an instant, the knight was slain. The tank was down, leaving a gaping hole in the team's defense. The mage's face turned pale and he shouted, "Retreat!" He quickly darted backward, but Lin shook his head. It was too late. One of the skeleton warriors hurled the knight's lifeless body into the air. The body exploded with a deafening blast. A thunderous roar erupted. The knight's body detonated, and the mage heard only a resounding boom before there was nothing more. Complete annihilation. The bursting corpse sounded like a world-shattering thunder, obliterating everything in its wake. On the ground, only a dozen mangled corpses remained. Not a single member of the Dynasty Guild survived. Countless items were scattered on the ground. Lin paid no attention to them, wiping the blood from his face before collecting everything. He used Corpse Explosion again, this time, leaving no trace of remains of the Dynasty Guild members. After completing these tasks, he finally entered the dungeon. The group of freelancers who had protested earlier finally dared to approach. They could hardly believe that a single person had wiped out the entire Dynasty Guild team. The onlookers knew that the Dynasty Guild wouldn't take this lying down, and they were uncertain about what to do next. One of them suggested that they should leave immediately, departing from Western Sea City and the province, far away from the Dynasty Guild's influence. His proposal was immediately accepted by everyone. With his instigation, everyone began to retreat, and in the blink of an eye, the entrance to the dungeon became devoid of people. Half an hour later, several individuals were teleported out of the dungeon. A blond man's face bore a hint of disappointment. Despite their venture into the dungeon, they still couldn't obtain the Goblin King's crystal core. Suddenly, a female adventurer beside him noticed that there was not a single person nearby, not even their own team members or other freelancers. They couldn't fathom what had happened. The few individuals who accompanied Hao Ran, who's the son of the guild leader on this dungeon run, looked panicked. Being only at level 17, their experience paled in comparison to the mage and the others guarding the entrance. At this moment, they could only rely on Hao Ran as their backbone. After all, he was the young guild leader of the Dynasty Guild. After contemplating for a while, he finally spoke. "Deploy the signal flare," hoping to get response from the mage and the other. However, in his mind, he couldn't understand why. There was no sign of battle or any traces left. One signal flare soared into the sky, bursting open to form a massive ball of light. Hao Ran realized that something must have happened to the mage and the others during the time he was inside the dungeon. He instructed everyone to follow him and leave first, as there might be danger in this area. Alone in the dungeon, Lin commanded 64 skeleton warriors relentlessly charging forward, employing the same strategy as before, swiftly gaining experience. This time the efficiency was even higher than the previous one, and after merely an hour, Lin had reached the end of the dungeon. The 64 skeleton warriors surrounded the Goblin King, bombarding him relentlessly. In just 30 seconds, the formidable nightmare-level boss fell to the ground in utter frustration. Defeating the Goblin King, experience plus 40,000, obtained a bronze-level weapon, the Goblin King's spellbook, and a low-level monster crystal core. As expected, this time the Goblin King's crystal core did not drop again. Instead, it turned into a low-level monster crystal core. Lin checked the properties of the Goblin King's spellbook. Goblin King's spellbook. Bronze level, plus 10 spirit, plus 10 health, 3% increase in mage skills power. Looking at the attributes, while it wasn't perfect, it would do for now. Holding the book, it seemed to have some value. In the process of slaying the Goblin King, Lin reached level 13. He quickly calculated that if he wanted to reach level 15, he would need to go through approximately 3 more dungeons. However, time was running short, and he could only do a maximum of 5 dungeon runs. At most, he could reach level 16, which was still slightly lower than his initial expectations. But level 16 would be sufficient for the entrance exam at Xiajing Academy. Lin exited the dungeon. Outside the dungeon, it was eerily quiet, unusually peaceful. Lin pondered for a moment and essentially understood the cause and effect of what had happened. Leaving was probably the best choice for those freelancers. Surveying his surroundings, he didn't linger either. While waiting for the dungeon cool down, the next day, another team finally arrived at the entrance of the dungeon. Charlotte had also reached level 10, and the skeleton warriors around Lynn were quite conspicuous. She was well aware that Lynn was the only one in the world with such summons. Charlotte looked at Lynn and understood that he's going to solo it. She had just reached level 10 today and came straight to the dungeon. She never expected that Lynn would be able to solo it. Once again, Lynn was one step faster than her. In the nightmare-level dungeon, Lynn plowed through the enemies. Now, a legion of 72 skeleton warriors had been assembled. Just 45 minutes later, Lynn encountered an old friend, the Goblin King who woke up on the great swords of the skeleton warriors. By the time it stood up, more than half of its health was already depleted. Flames erupted from its mouth, but was interrupted by the soul flame, interrupting its skills. In just 30 seconds, the Goblin King once again fell in utter frustration. After defeating the Goblin King, gained experience 40,000, and the loot dropped as before. Lynn glanced at the items and stored them in his storage space. The Goblin King's eyes carried a mixture of unwillingness and frustration. That gaze seemed to suggest that it recognized Lynn. Lynn waved his hand, indicating that it didn't matter who killed him. At least Lynn gave him a quick death. In truth, he said he didn't want to kill the Goblin King either, but there was no other way. He needed to level up. Lynn softly spoke to the Goblin King, regardless of whether it understood or not. Another 12 hours passed, and Lynn returned once again to see his old friend, after slaying the Goblin King. Lynn also reached level 14, and the number of skeleton warriors increased to 76. While waiting outside the dungeon for the cool down, he encountered an old classmate. Hearing a familiar voice, he opened his eyes and saw Charlotte. Dust smudged her delicate face, and she had injuries, clearly having just experienced a battle as she had just come out of the dungeon. She stared at Lynn, her face full of dissatisfaction. She asked him what level he was, and Lynn calmly replied that he was level 14. Charlotte couldn't believe it. How could Lynn have leveled up so quickly? She had teamed up with others and repeatedly cleared the Western Sea Mine dungeon on normal difficulty twice, and it took her from level 10 to 11. Back-to-back dungeons had left her completely exhausted. She knew Lynn could solo dungeons, but he couldn't possibly level up this fast. Charlotte couldn't have imagined that Lynn was running nightmare-level dungeons. Her sense of dissatisfaction towards him only grew stronger. She huffed, "I won't admit defeat." Saying so, she turned and left. Lynn watched her, not knowing what to say. Suddenly, he saw Charlotte and a few others enter the dungeon. Lynn witnessed something incredible. Dungeons had cooldown periods, but Charlotte had just come out. How could she go back in so quickly? He had tried both normal and nightmare difficulties, and dungeons always had cooldowns. Yet Charlotte could re-enter repeatedly. An hour later, she completed another dungeon run. After coming out of the dungeon, Charlotte didn't forget to glance back at Lynn. He could see her exhaustion from her expression, the kind of fatigue that resulted from continuous battles. Shortly after, in just a little over 10 minutes, Charlotte found another team and went into the dungeon again. Half an hour later, exhausted, she exited from the dungeon. She was so tired that she didn't even want to move a finger. Charlotte, with her weariness, sat down beside Lynn. Lynn asked her why she was pushing herself so hard, and Charlotte replied with annoyance, she can't believe that Lynn has the nerve to ask her why. For years, she is always second behind Lynn. She must surpass Lynn. Lynn never expected Charlotte to hold such deep resentment. If he had known, he would have given her an easy time during a certain exam and let her achieve first place too. Charlotte looked up at the sky. She also wanted to get into Xiajing Academy. Level 15 would be secure, but level 16 would guarantee her admission. Lynn recommended her to run nightmare-level dungeons to level up faster. Charlotte stared at Lynn with her big eyes, thinking he was joking or perhaps teasing her. Nightmare dungeons required elite teams, and those people were all 16 or 17 level professionals. Nobody would take a level 12 like her. Charlotte gave Lynn a disdainful look, as if saying, "Do you even understand anything at all?" Hearing Lynn's silence, Charlotte continued, "That's why she better run several more normal level dungeons. She should be able to get to level 14, and with some effort, level 15 might be possible." Finally, Lynn spoke up, finally asking how Charlotte was able to bypass the dungeon cooldown.